We were charged with talking a little bit about audiences today and the relationship with audiences as a major orchestra like the New York Philharmonic is. And so as Alan and I talked in preparation for today, we talked about a wide range of things, but one of the things I will tell you that I've been very energized about by coming to the New York Philharmonic and working with Alan is the new approach and the new way of thinking about the relationship with the audience and what we might do for the future to further enhance that relationship. And I thought I might just start by asking Alan to briefly talk about his approach, as this is now his third season as the music director of the New York Philharmonic, having grown up around the orchestra, having grown up in New York City. And I think he has some really interesting ideas about what he wants to do, what he has done and wants to do in terms of the relationship with the audience in New York and outside of New York. And I thought I might just start off with that question, which is, what do you see as the end goal? I mean, what do you see as the ideal in terms of the relationship you have as music director and the orchestra has with its audiences?
Well, it's obviously something that occupies my mind and our minds kind of all the time, because as Brent mentioned in his remarks, it really is about the audience, and it's about, in some sort of elusive way, building the audience. I guess I'd like to start by talking about myself as sort of an example of an audience member, because I have a long relationship with the New York Philharmonic. Obviously, my parents were, and my mother still is, a violinist in the orchestra. So from a very young age, I was enjoying the New York Philharmonic from the seats. And, you know, the world is small, and the fact that I come from New York is, I guess, you know, of interest in a certain way. But actually, for me, the most important point is that I have been able to appreciate and know what the New York Philharmonic has been able to mean for me personally. And it's been enormous, both as ultimately a professional musician, but as someone who simply loves music. And I've been able to follow the New York Philharmonic over a long arc and experience 3 different music directors before me and see some of the same players over all these years. And in a sense, although I'm obviously an unusual case as far as that goes, because I was connected really to the inside of the orchestra, I hope that kind of long-term arc and long-term relationship can be a model for what we're trying to achieve with our audiences, because it really is about a relationship. We talk about what the constitution of our audiences is. Who are the people who come? There are some tourists, obviously people who come one time, but I'm interested in building this long-term relationship. And I think what's possible over a long period of time is a building of trust and a building of a sense of understanding. And maybe I'm getting ahead of the discussion now, but what I'm looking for is the possibility to build a connection and a trust and a relationship with the audience that is the basis for exploration and risk-taking, and the possibility to essentially program something that might be totally unknown and have it received with open arms and with enthusiasm, despite the fact that many of the people in the audience may have never heard that before. If people trust that we're going to come up with interesting ideas and interesting projects, and if they believe that we're selecting the music we play and playing it with heart and sincerity and honesty and enthusiasm, maybe it doesn't become such a question of, okay, are we going to play this piece or that piece? It's more about the experience of what we can share within the 4 walls of the concert hall.
Do you perceive it to be different or more difficult or more complicated? I mean, Brent alluded to the distractions of our world today. I think we all know that the world is a different place than it certainly was 20 or 30 years ago. Do you feel that there's that element of distraction, and that delivering music at the highest level in order to earn that trust is more complicated, whether there's a cell phone going off during a performance, or whether it's just the noise and the busyness that we experience in everyday life?
Clearly, the world has changed, and people are very connected to their phones. Did you bring your phone with you?
It's
Matthew?
off, actually.
Yeah. You know the alarm still goes off even if the phone is off.
Right.
That's what we as we learned. It cuts both ways. The world is. It's possible to access so much information so quickly, anywhere, anytime, and it's possible to, the whole nature of surfing the web, going from one web page to the next, is almost necessarily sort of short-term, and following something through and allowing somebody else to determine the pace at which you receive information or choosing what information you're processing is, it's maybe not as evident as it once was. There's an immediate gratification that is perhaps different from following a Bruckner symphony through from beginning to end and allowing it to take the course that it takes. But on the other hand, I think that, if anything, highlights the beauty and the sacred nature of what we do in a concert hall, in a live music performance. There was a lot of chatter and quite a bit of coverage about the cell phone that went off in our Mahler 9 concert back in January. The story was, it was what it was, but for me the takeaway was that on some sort of intuitive level, people responded so strongly to that event because I think there's this kind of inherent understanding of the inviolable quality of what happens in a concert hall. I personally believe that's why it was so exciting. That's why music lovers and classical music aficionados and lay people on the street found it interesting because it just seemed incomprehensible. How could you stop a concert? And to me, that's actually gratifying to realize that people were disturbed by the notion that the live concert experience was interrupted.
I mean, one of the things that I struggle with, or I've been thinking of, are the different messages that we're sent as orchestras. We have a ritualistic history and tradition, which Alan alluded to before, the sense of being in a sacred place and hearing music in a very controlled environment. And I feel sometimes, as someone who is running an orchestra, is that there's pressure to get rid of that formality, to break away that sense of just formality and sacredness, if you will, within the concert hall. And I think I'm not sure that there's an answer for that. I think that.
Sorry to interrupt, but as is the case, I think with so many things, I think balance is of the essence. I think throwing around a word like sacred can be dangerous because it can sound unapproachable and lofty and sort of removed. But I mean it in the most sort of immediate human sense, and and if that dimension can be preserved, while at the same time making sure that people are not intimidated by the ritualistic, sort of formalized aspect of concert going. I mean, it doesn't happen so much anymore, which I think is a good thing, but I remember I used to hear people say, oh, I can't go to a symphony concert, I wouldn't understand, or I don't know, I wouldn't know how to behave, or I wouldn't know when to clap, or I don't have a tuxedo. I mean, you hear, seriously, I mean, you hear these things, and that's, it's in response to that many orchestras have had casual concerts, or wear your jeans, or have the orchestra not wearing clothes that, let's face it, nobody wears in real life. These tailed penguin suits and things. I like preserving the tradition and the sort of old world ritual of the concert because I think it should feel special. But that doesn't mean you have to do all concerts that way, and that doesn't mean you can't break down the concert format and speak from the stage so that the audience can hear that the people on stage actually are hopefully, well, it may or may not be the case, but normal people, or have a chamber music piece in the middle of a symphony concert, or why not a poetry reading? That happens sometimes if it's somehow connected to the music, or a jazz combo. There are a lot of things that I think are absolutely fair game that can disrupt people's preconceptions about what sort of unapproachable classical music concerts are, but still not actually get in the way of the essence of what we're doing.
I think that, for me, that's that question of delivery, for lack of a better way to put it, which is that it's not about changing the music we play, but maybe being willing to consider a wider array of ways in which we actually deliver music to people, like you say. One of the things that I was really fascinated to watch from a distance over the last couple of years are some of the most innovative projects, I think, even within all of the orchestral sector around the world. Groundbreaking, innovative projects like the presentation of Ligoti's Le Grand Macabre. Last year, the performances of Janacek's Cunning Little Vixen. Coming up at the end of June, the Philharmonic and Alan will present a spatial music concert, Philharmonic 360, at the Park Avenue Armory with Stockhausen's Gruppen, Ives, Pierre Boulez. This idea of expanding the notion of a concert, of what a concert can be. Can you talk a little bit about thinking now and what's happened thus far and where you think that might go?
Well, first of all, it's nice to hear these projects pitched. Thanks very much for bringing them up. No, I'm really excited about these projects, and for me, it's about what we're doing. You may know a little bit about the staged opera productions we've done, and now we're going out of the hall for this spatial music concert that it's all music that relies on the physicality of the space in which it's performed. This armory is an enormous, empty sort of tabula rasa in the middle of New York on Park Avenue, and it kind of begs to be used in creative and innovative ways, and I think it's going to be very exciting. But at the root of all of this, it's not just an expansion of what orchestras present, but even more fundamentally, what orchestras are. And I'm interested in the discussion that will ultimately arrive at the point where people are not thinking about this kind of project done by a traditional orchestra, such as the New York Philharmonic, as being a kind of special on the side, but as something that is absolutely straight down the center of what we are about and what we can provide as orchestras. And I think that will require a gradual sort of shift in the way both we internally think about ourselves and audiences think about orchestras as well. Of course, orchestras are organisms that produce symphonic concerts. That is one aspect of what we do. But more and more, I think we are called on to be resources and catalysts for cultural and intellectual inquiry. Of course, the New York Philharmonic is not an opera orchestra, but the orchestra's role in these productions that we've done is so crucial and so important. It's something that the New York Philharmonic can do. It's a little bit, be what you can be. And I think that orchestras can be leaders in education, can be focal points of connections between institutions within cities. In short, I think that we are and should be recognized as so much more than just concert-producing machines.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree so wholeheartedly. I think I began my career actually as an orchestral musician, and was constantly wondering why we weren't expanding the very notion of what we are and what we do. And I mean, I think something like today is fantastic. It's a perfect example of the orchestra as resource, thinking of the centennial year not just as a series of great concerts, but as an exploration, including the types of topics that we're discussing here today. I think as we've discussed that path for the New York Philharmonic, I think it's terribly exciting, that idea of expanding the notion of what the Philharmonic means in New York, really making it an integral part of the city, how we think of the New York Philharmonic on a national scale and certainly international. The orchestra has such a strong global presence and brand. I think it's the opportunities are really endless, but the question is how do we make those decisions? How do we take those steps to be something more than we've been historically?
Well, getting back to the sort of direct question or the direct point of inquiry, audiences, I think the first thing we do is that we stop making assumptions about what audiences want. There's, programming is it's well known that programming is something that I've been interested in and spend a lot of time and energy with. At the end of the day, it's not so much about programming, though. It's about the connection with the audience, as I said. One thing that has been an impediment, I think, to letting the ideas really flow freely, both at the New York Philharmonic, but elsewhere as well, I found that I hear very often, oh, well, our audience doesn't like that. Oh, our audience expects this. And I think that's pretty dangerous. Or you'll hear things like, well, the older people in the audience only want to hear music that they know already.
We have some,
really?
We have some followers here.
Really? And the young people just want to hear new music.
Yeah.
I mean, these gross oversimplifications that are obviously, if you actually hold them up, and doesn't even take a lot of scrutiny to realize that they're just complete nonsense. The point is that I think people can be led in a good way, can be shown things about themselves that they don't necessarily know, can learn things about what they can appreciate and enjoy, and that's one of, I think, the important functions, and that's why the relationship with the audience has to be more than just a point in time, more than one intersection at one particular concert. It's about a kind of attitude. It's a kind of atmosphere that will hopefully just glow around the New York Philharmonic or the San Francisco Symphony, and it will lead people to want to take risks and experience things that they don't necessarily know or even know that they would be able to appreciate.
Do you like the fact that you have so many more ways to communicate now, certainly off the podium, in terms of social media, in terms of, even the cell phone story was, Alan was relaying to us backstage that, he turned down multiple interviews from all the major networks to go on and do an interview about the cell phone incident itself. But you actually have an app that's out now which shows the inside of your studio, and how do you reconcile that with what you do on the podium artistically?
Well, it can be difficult because essentially I have to prepare my music, study it, and try to conduct it as well as I can and show up and deliver a good concert. That takes a lot of time and energy. The other side of what I do, which is the advocacy side, the public side, doing events like this, for example, I feel challenged and a bit daunted because it's a real responsibility, but it's also an incredible opportunity to be able to have an idea and actually realistically think, oh well, let's find out a way to get a story in the New York Times. 20 years ago, if you had told me that just because I had an idea, I might be able to get someone to write it about in the New York Times, that would have been ridiculous. I feel incredibly privileged to have this platform and to be able to try to do something about which I really feel very passionately.
Some of you may have seen, there was a wonderful piece by Dan Waken in the New York Times, which online also had these fantastic interactive components in which you were filmed. You were actually filmed, and can you talk a little bit about, this was a piece about the art of conducting, the physical side of conducting.
It was something, I wasn't sure what it would be when I was first approached to do this, but it turned out to be really interesting for me and people who have seen the piece. Both the print article and the interactive feature on the Times website said it was interesting as well. Essentially, I conducted an ensemble of Juilliard students in a piece by Stravinsky, and I was outfitted with a kind of bizarre spacesuit-looking thing with reflectors at various points on my arms and head and face and things. And there were cameras around the room, extremely high-tech, precise cameras that were able to record in 3D every gesture I made. Essentially what you can see is, it's the technology that they use to make video games, or like say, they'll outfit Tiger Woods in, not that I compare myself in any way to Tiger Woods, but he'll get into a studio and do exactly this, and then his motions become that becomes the avatar in the game, and it's amazing technology. And it was fascinating to me to see myself, and I thought they did the piece very well. And this kind of thing is interesting to my conducting students said it was interesting to watch what I was doing, but it's also a way of adding dimension and scope to what we represent to our public. So I don't think it took a lot of time, but it felt like it was actually part of what we're trying to do in the grand scheme of things.
I loved the story. I thought it was sensational. I also have already started sort of saying to Dan, the next piece of that puzzle is really what happens besides the physicality of conducting. What happens with the connection with a conductor and the orchestra? What happens with the physicality of a conductor and the connection with an audience, which is much more intangible.
Well, I mean, Dan said himself that it was a limited piece, that it was great as far as it went, but it was very consciously designed to talk about the physical gesture. And he said at the end, oh well, of course it's all about that undefinable kind of aura or mental or spiritual connection, but he didn't really get into that. So there definitely is room for more pursuit in that.
How conscious of the audience actually in the concert hall are you during your performance? And aside from cell phones going off, but I mean, how aware are you of that?
It's interesting because I think we've all experienced this. Generally speaking, audiences are polite and quiet and are not making noise. But there's a certain kind of quiet that only happens when there's a real special magical connection happening. And it's uncanny because you can feel it. And I don't know if there were a sound meter in the hall, if it would actually be quieter, but you know what I'm talking about, when suddenly everybody's breathing the same breath and everybody's heart is beating the same beat. And you're really aware of that, and I actually would be interesting to know if physically there's anything going on. I have a feeling it's more than that. That's an example of how conscious you can be of the audience. It depends on the hall. There's some halls, when you're on tour, as we are now, you're aware of already when you're coming out on stage for the first time before the orchestra's played one note, you can hear the applause either more or less. Sometimes it feels remote. Usually when the audience's applause feels remote, that means that from the other side, the orchestra probably sounds a bit remote as well. So the acoustics work both ways, and this kind of symbiotic relationship is absolutely an essential part of the equation. That's why it's rare that something absolutely, sort of at the end of the line, sort of over the top excitement happens in rehearsal, because you need the audience to do that. The audience gives back. And actually, speaking to audience members, I think you may not realize how much influence you can have with your concentration, with your will, on the gestalt of the moment.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, I think.
I mean, I think this is something that we can certainly learn a lot from the conducting standpoint, but within the orchestral world, maybe historically we haven't been as cognizant of how we physically present a concert, that sense of commitment. You know when it's right, and yet to do it consistently and to really capture the audience's imagination each and every night is a challenge. But I think this is something that you and I have spoken about already, which is that are there ways to physically commit an orchestra in a way that even pulls the audience in closer?
Well, I mean, there's so many levels on which to discuss this and to offer a stab at an answer. I think there's a responsibility on both sides, and there are things that are often not spoken about on the orchestra side, like how the orchestra looks on stage, how whether they smile or not during the bows. These things actually matter, and I think that they're fundamentally about this kind of two-way channel of communication and respect and trust and understanding. we're doing the best we can, and all I can say is that over time, I think that there has been an evolution, at least in New York. I can start to talk about 3 years now. It's hard to believe, but you know, with, for example, Magnus Lindberg, our composer in residence, he wasn't unknown. He was already 3 years ago one of the most important living composers. You'll hear tonight, if you're at the concert, his piano concerto, an amazing new piece that we premiered last week. But he wasn't a familiar figure. Certainly people didn't necessarily know what he looked like. But now when he comes on stage after 3 years, there's a palpable sense of recognition and identity, and oh, that's our guy. And that's been really gratifying.
Yeah, well, and he's such an effusive sort of personality as well. I mean, he really has life as he comes out. But I would say, not to embarrass Alan, but my opportunities to hear the New York Philharmonic, even over the last year, has proven to me that there's something very special happening with this orchestra right now. And I don't mean that in a gratuitous way. I think it's really, there's a sense of intention, there's a sense of commitment that I think is really translating to our audiences in to New York, and hopefully here this evening and tomorrow evening here in Davies Hall. So I see that we are at the end of our discussion, but I'd like to thank all of you for being here and thank Alan for his thoughts and his words this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for the kind words, and thank you, everybody here, Brent, and the people who have invited us, for giving us this chance to really barely scratch the surface of something that's incredibly complicated and incredibly fascinating, and hopefully a discussion that will be going on for a long time.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, it's an interesting question. Just to repeat in case you didn't hear it, are we finding that there's more acceptance of new music or new ways of presenting old music? I don't know that I could answer that, but I will say that we are conscious of both. And, you know, I've said this in what I hoped would be, it was deliberately provocative. I said, I don't feel that I'm an advocate for new music. That was seized on in a kind of unusual way in some quarters, because obviously I'm interested in new music, but I don't consider myself a specialist. And when we program, we don't think, oh, we need to get this many new pieces into the season. It just doesn't happen. That's not something we talk about. We talk about the range of composers that we feel should be represented in our season, that should be played by our orchestra, because that's an important component too. It's important for the orchestra to remain challenged and to be presented with new material to play, and that we feel our audiences should hear. There are no quotas involved, and what I hope, this is maybe not a direct answer to your question, but again, related to what I said earlier, what I hope is that when we play a new piece, there's a much bigger context that it can be listened to than just the fact that it's a new piece. It's music. It happens not to be music that has been played before, maybe by a composer that the name of whom people don't know, but there's not a slot on a program that we say, okay, here's where we're going to put the new piece. We try to create programs that are organically and holistically conceived, and that make sense, and that create a context in which each work on the program can be appreciated to the fullest. And what I've been observing, and it's anecdotal to an extent, is that people are taking the new pieces that we play more and more seriously. And I believe, I certainly want to believe, but I do in fact believe that that's because we're getting away from any notion of tokenism, that we're presenting these new works out of a sense of duty. And I actually feel that is what is hopefully the true sincerity of the motivation behind our program is actually translating into more and more acceptance over time.
Just one little addition to that question. What do you think about the role of places like Le Poisson Rouge, for example, in building audiences for more unusual or newer music?
For those of you who may not know, the Poisson Rouge is essentially a club at which different kinds of music events happen. It's a very exciting place downtown in Manhattan. I think places like that are very important, and one of the things that Matthew and I have already talked about is the identity of the New York Philharmonic with the city. And that means that we are hoping that the orchestra will gradually become known more and more as a, I don't know, a creature with tentacles that go out into the city. We actually haven't played yet at Le Poisson Rouge, but we've done our Contact contemporary music concerts at the Metropolitan Museum, at the Symphony Space. We're exploring ideas of other alternative, perhaps surprising venues. Places like the Poisson Rouge or BAM or different venues in the city do have their own audiences, and I think potentially what we do could be very interesting to those audiences as well. So we're tracking
But
that.
hopefully
very well.
it works in the other direction too, that Poisson Rouge audiences will be more open-minded about coming to hear the Philharmonic.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
One or two more. Yeah. If I can just say, I don't know if you all heard that, but just to sort of encapsulate, we're going to run out of time with questions like this.
They will bring the hook out.
Yeah, who's going to get it? I'll just say two things. About the idea that sometimes there's more contemporary music, sometimes less, that it goes in cycles. That's probably true to an extent, but we did an examination of that, because the way the New York Philharmonic has been written about over the years is, oh, this year they got it right, this year they didn't get it right. You know, it seems to go up and down. That's perception. It's surprisingly consistent over the years, and that's not intentional, but how many new works, the types of American works are done, and I think you have to be careful not to assume that because your perception is one way, that's exactly how it is, because, you know, things do change, obviously, but it's not necessarily as much of a swing as you might think. And as far as clothing goes, one of my favorite topics, but we'll make this the closing remark. I do feel that there should be a uniform. There should be a sense of, okay, you get dressed up for work, because that shows a certain respect. It shows a dignity, respect of the dignity of the occasion. I'm not quite so sure that it has to be tails. I happen to like wearing tails sometimes, but I also think that all black can look really good. And sometimes the uniform, you know, we've done colored shirts and dark pants. I mean, it should look like a uniform. The point is that maybe it doesn't so much matter what it is, because that's at the end of the day not really the most important thing.
Yeah.
I think we should go.
We should
Thank
go.
you very
Thank
much.
You.